Hi everybody, and welcome to another One History Help video with me, Mrs. O'Neill. This is the second video in my series on the causes of the Second World War, and this one is all about Hitler's rearmament program. Be warned, I reckon this one might be a long one, so just to give you a bit of a heads up, because there's lots to cover. Rather than looking at individual events in each video, I'm trying to group them all together, much like I spoke about in my first video, which looked at Hitler's foreign policy. I would strongly recommend that before you start onto this video looking at rearmament, that you have a bit of a reminder about the causes of the Treaty of Versailles, because a lot of the parts to do with Hitler's rearmament program and leading up to the Second World War, a big part of it is about that key aim of Hitler's foreign policy, all about abolishing the Treaty of Versailles. And as we're talking rearmament, we're definitely going to be wanting to look at this stuff here, okay? We're definitely going to be wanting to look at all of the bits and pieces to do with how the Treaty of Versailles limited the German armed forces. If you want more on that, check out my video on the Treaty of Versailles, which you can find on this channel. It's a bit of a long one, but I'm pretty confident I put chapters in there so you can skip to the bit which is all about the military restrictions on the treaty itself. Definitely want to check that out before you move forward with looking at the rearmament as part of the causes of the Second World War. Love, there's a little bit of dual coding here for our timeline, some images to go along with the key events to do with rearmament that we're going to be taking a look at. Hopefully, again, if you're watching this video from the point of view of revision, you can look at some of these little icons that we've got here and you can think, I wonder what that's about. Can I remember what that image is trying to demonstrate? If you're watching this for the first time, then in terms of learning about the causes of the Second World War for the first time, then I will be explaining all of the different images as we go through the different causes. And for this video, looking at rearmament, I'm going to go through it year by year, starting off in 1933. And what I'll be doing is, once we get to 1936, I'm going to be grouping the later part of the 1930s together, because as we're going to see, a lot of the causes to do with rearmament happen earlier on in the 1930s, and as we'll see in another video, the idea of conquering Lebensraum is something that very much takes over into the later 1930s. Let's take a look at our first year, looking at rearmament in the 1930s, starting off in 1933. January 1933 is the time when Hitler officially comes to power as Chancellor of Germany. That's why a lot of the points to do with Hitler's actions leading up to World War II are pretty much marked from 1933. That's not to say that the causes of World War II don't extend before then, but if we're looking at Hitler and his point of view, that's the date we're going to be starting from. So January 1933 is when Hitler comes to power. Again, those of you who have studied Nazi Germany in more detail for your GCSE course will know that Hitler does a lot in that first year when he comes to power. But obviously we're looking at this from the point of view of foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy. So in October 1933, Hitler withdraws Germany from the League of Nations. And he does that because in 1933 is the year when the League of Nations is trying to kickstart their rearmament program again. And that's what our little guy there kind of chucking the gun in the bin is there to represent is disarmament. It will not surprise us to understand that Hitler strongly disagrees with the concept of disarmament, and therefore he sees that being in the League of Nations is completely pointless to Germany, and he withdraws from it. Remember, Germany had really fought in the 1920s to be part of the League of Nations, and thanks to the work of Gustav Stresemann, they are invited to join the League of Nations in 1926. So Hitler, again, early foreign policy here, withdrawing Germany from the League of Nations over disarmament, and then pretty much in the same breath he begins Germany's rearmament program, building tanks, building aeroplanes, armoured vehicles, weapons, to mention but a few. And again, another time when this very much crosses over with domestic policy is another thing that Hitler promised the German people when they were voting for him was employment, was jobs. Germany possibly more so than any other country in Europe at this time, was really suffering from the Great Depression. They had borrowed a lot of money from America during the 1920s to be able to stay afloat, repay reparations from the Treaty of Versailles and so on and so forth. And knowing that America is obviously being very heavily affected by the Great Depression, they are calling those loans in. Germany is broke. So unemployment, is skyrocketing in Germany in the early 1930s. Hitler promises the people jobs, and a surefire way to get people back into the workforce is to get them building weapons, building tanks, and so on and so forth. Again, this is a great example of how Hitler is using his rearmament program to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany were not allowed to have any tanks, no airplanes, no armoured vehicles, no submarines either. They were limited on the number of battleships they could have, only 6. So this rearmament program is him fulfilling that promise of breaking the Treaty of Versailles. What's important for us to notice, and this will come up quite a bit in looking at rearmament as a cause of the Second World War, is that Britain doesn't bat an eyelid. Hitler is directly breaking the Treaty of Versailles by building up his armament program, and Britain doesn't do anything at all, because at this time Britain genuinely feels that the Treaty of Versailles was incredibly unfair towards Germany, and that Hitler was well within his rights to try and build up Germany's armed forces again. Everybody else in the 1930s, after the Wall Street crash and with the Great Depression kicking in, everybody else was becoming very isolated in their nations and making sure that they were strong enough, because this was a time when the world was very vulnerable. So people in Britain felt Hitler is well within his rights to protect his country. Everybody else is doing the same. Hard to imagine, isn't it, that at the beginning of the 1930s we weren't as worried about Hitler as history has gone on to make us believe. So this is a theme that, again, that we'll keep coming back to. Britain didn't bat an eyelid. France at this time were obviously very concerned. However, France during the 1930s is going through huge levels of political turmoil and political instability, so they're not really in a very strong position to be able to deal with anything. The main event from 1934, which we're going to have a look at, is less to do with rearmament, but is more to do with another cycle that's going on that I want to make you aware of. And that is whenever Hitler does something bad, i.e. things like breaking the Treaty of Versailles, he tends to follow it up by doing something good. And this is a great example of that. So as we've just seen in 1933, Hitler withdraws Germany from the League of Nations and begins his huge rearmament program that directly breaks the Treaty of Versailles. But then, to kind of throw people off the scent, if you will, in 1934, Hitler does something good. And by something good, we're talking about a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. Now, in hindsight, we can look back and laugh at this moment, because we know that any non-aggression pact with Poland doesn't even last out the decade, let alone 10 actual years. Okay, that's not even going to be good in 5 years' time. But we know that in hindsight. But at the time, people didn't know that. And as well as France being very suspicious about Hitler's rearmament program, the people of Poland were as well, because they knew that territory in Poland was once part of Germany. For instance, we have the Polish corridor, which is dividing Germany into 2 separate sections. So they knew that it was quite likely that Hitler would be coming for them as well. So he signed this 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland to essentially throw people off the scent from the bad, quote-unquote, things he was doing. So this essentially guarantees the Polish borders that existed as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And Britain in particular really paid attention to this. So while he was developing his armament program, building up tanks and airplanes and everything like that, Britain were kind of thinking, let's put that bit to one side and let's focus on the good things that he was doing. So Britain likes this because it felt it showed Hitler's peaceful intentions. And again, with hindsight, we can look back on this and we can think, what? Seriously? You guys were fooled by this? But we've got to put ourselves into the minds of people at the time. Nobody in 1933 wanted another war. Nobody in the rest of the 1930s wanted another war. Although to us, again, with the distance of time and with hindsight, we feel that World War I and World War II are so far apart. But for the people living in Britain and France as well, World War I was still very much in their minds. It had only been over for, let's have a look, roughly about 15 years by the time we're looking at here. And that wasn't that long ago. Okay, if you think about the span of 15 years, that wasn't that long ago. So again, we look back in hindsight and think, you really looked at Hitler's peaceful intentions and you believed that? Well, yes, of course they did. Because at the time, they would have done anything to stop another war from happening, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the bad things that he was doing. Next, we move into 1935, and this is where things are really starting to step up in terms of the rearmament program itself. We have got two events that we're going to look at that happened in 1935, and again it brings in that cycle we've just been talking about there, with Hitler doing something bad and following it up with something good. Let's talk about the something bad, quote unquote, first of all. In early 1935, Hitler reintroduces conscription to Germany. And this is important because it was directly forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles set the German army at how many men? Let's give you a chance to remember. 100,000. 100,000 men in the German army, and conscription was forbidden. So they were not able to intentionally increase their army. Remember, conscription is when you force men of a fighting age to fight in the army. Directly forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles, but was reintroduced by Hitler in 1935 in response to France, who had extended their conscription rules in 1934. They had increased the age limit that people were allowed to be conscripted in, which meant there were more men eligible for conscription. So in response to this, Hitler reintroduced conscription in 1935. And again, Britain, and we'll chuck them in here as well, the League of Nations, led by Britain and France, does absolutely nothing about this reintroduction of conscription, even though it directly goes against the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, like I said earlier, Britain, the people of Britain, believe that the Treaty of Versailles is unjust and unfair on Germany. So reintroducing conscription is something that they do not have a problem with, especially much like France was, for instance, other countries were doing the same. Although, side note, Britain does not introduce conscription again itself until 1938. But again, this is the kind of something bad that we're looking at here. There's something good that Hitler follows up with in 1935 is the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement. And as you can tell from the title of it, it is a naval agreement between Britain and Germany. And this agreement that was reached was seen as further proof, quote unquote, of Hitler's peaceful intentions. Now, this is really demonstrating, I think, how much people were trying to avoid another war from happening. When you think back to the causes of the First World War, the German and English naval race, the Anglo-German naval race that was going on, building things like dreadnoughts, for instance, was a significant cause of the First World War, that rivalry that existed. Fast forward 30 years later, and now we are seeing Britain and Germany actually reaching an agreement about the Navy. You may remember from the Treaty of Versailles that David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, was very keen to limit Germany's Navy. Give you a second to remember what the naval restrictions were. So it came out as 15,000 men in the Navy and 6 battleships only. Okay, they were the only things that were permitted. However, this Anglo-German naval agreement in 1935 will change that, because they decided that Germany could build their navy, but it could only be 35% the size of Britain's. So it would never ever be bigger than Britain's, but it would be bigger than what the Treaty of Versailles set out. The thing I love about this is that the percentage that was agreed on, that 35%, is exactly the same as the year that it happened in. Okay, so this is a really, really nice memory hook to help you remember dates. If you remember the percentage size, then you remember the date. If you remember the date, you remember the percentage size. Okay, really, really nice memory hook there. What's important to note here is that the Anglo-German Naval Agreement didn't include anything about the building of submarines. So Hitler took that to mean he had carte blanche, no restrictions whatsoever, when it came to how many submarines he was allowed to build, despite the fact that the treaty said he wasn't allowed to build any. By signing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, Britain is essentially putting their seal of approval, their stamp of approval, on Germany's rearmament program. They are saying, I see what you're doing, I see you, I see what you're doing, and we say that's okay. So long as you don't encroach on our navy, remember our navy, even into World War II, is something that we were very much focused on protecting, wanting to have that strong navy as an island nation. It is so incredibly crucial. Okay, so as long as they're not encroaching on the size of our navy, then if you want to build up things, that is fine by us. Again, we look back now and think, guys, seriously? Come on. But back then, they wanted to avoid war at all costs. Britain's navy was a big part of national pride, and they felt by putting that 35% limit on there, they had still retained that pride and that sense of supremacy. 1936 is a big year for Hitler's rearmament program. It is the year of the invasion of the Rhineland. Many of you, I'm sure, will have looked at this cartoon when you studied the Rhineland invasion. I certainly use it when I teach about it because it really brings together this idea of how the invasion of the Rhineland basically happened whilst nobody else was around. Let's talk more about that. So under the Treaty of Versailles, the Rhineland was deemed to be a demilitarized zone. More on this in detail in the video on the Treaty of Versailles, but essentially the Rhineland was there to act as a buffer zone between Germany and France. The little silhouette of land that you can see on the screen just here, if I just grab myself a pen quickly, so this like kind of silhouette of land that you can see here, that is representative of the Rhineland. Okay, so it's part of the eastern border of Germany. So over here is France, and then the rest of this is Germany here. And the idea was that this would act as a buffer zone between Germany and France, where there was to be no military whatsoever. As the phrase says, it was a demilitarized zone. What we need to be careful of is that the Rhineland was never taken away from Germany. It was still technically part of German territory. The only thing that was different to the rest of the German territory is the fact that they were not allowed any armed forces there whatsoever. And that all changes on the 7th of March 1936, when German soldiers and German tanks go into the Rhineland. I like to remember it as they marched in March. Again, another nice little memory hook there, whatever kind of little patterns we can get to help us remember. So they go into the Rhineland, they march into the Rhineland in 1936, March 1936. Again, thinking about that cycle of does something bad, follows it up with something good. Following on from this invasion of the Rhineland, Hitler announces that he is going to sign a 25-year non-aggression pact pretty much with everybody, and says that he has no further ambitions in Europe. He was done, he was saying. You know, I've got the Rhineland, I'm happy. Okay, I've got my soldiers back in the Rhineland, I'm a happy chappy. Okay, don't need to go anywhere else. That was the intention with it. Again, does something bad, follows it up with something good. The League of Nations does absolutely nothing apart from morally condemn Hitler's actions. And the only nation at this time that really seems to want to punish Hitler for what he's doing is the USSR. Now, in the 1930s, the League of Nations is so desperate for members that it goes back on its original promise of the USSR, what we recognise today as Russia, will never be part of the League because of the communist dictatorship that is established there. Completely gone back on that. They are so desperate for numbers that pretty much by this time the only people left in the League are Britain, France, and the USSR. Hitler's timing of the invasion of the Rhineland was totally intentional. As he knew, in 1936, Britain and France were distracted with what was going on with Mussolini in Abyssinia. Again, remember that cartoon? I said he's going into the Rhineland and no one else is around. Well, that's because everyone's too busy dealing with Mussolini in Abyssinia. So he times it perfectly. That is no accident. That is no coincidence. He knows this is the best opportunity he has. This is also this idea again, and if you've watched my first video on the causes of World War II, where I talked about Taylor's interpretation, this is a great example of Hitler gambling. Okay, he's pushed for little things so far. This idea of putting a military back in the Rhineland right on France's doorstep is a really big deal. So this is pushing for more. But he does it at a time when Britain and France are preoccupied with what Mussolini is doing in Abyssinia. Also, as we have seen throughout the 1930s thus far, Britain, even in 1936, didn't think that what Hitler was doing was a problem. They thought it was only right that there should be a military in the Rhineland. One famous quote from the time from a leading politician whose name totally escapes me right now is that Britain was only marching in to their own backyard. It was only marching in to their own backyard. Just pause my recording to go and find who said that quote in a book. Lord Lothian, who was a British politician at this time, is the one who said that Germany was only going into her own back garden, own backyard. So again, even high up in British politics, they were thinking, well, what's the big deal? You know, he's only putting his army into his own territory. Why is that a problem? Again, this attitude that the treaty was harsh and that Germany should be allowed to defend their country. Again, we go back to this idea that nobody at this time wants a war, especially as Hitler keeps promising peace. And again, we've got to put ourselves in the minds of the people in 1936 and not here in the 21st century, where we can look back and know that Hitler's intentions weren't what he said they were. At this time, people wanted to avoid a war at all costs. So they would much more rather pay attention to that 25-year non-aggression pact than the idea of Hitler putting military in his own territory. This was a huge win for Hitler in Germany as well. The Rhineland being demilitarized was a huge, huge thorn in the side of the German population. And I love this statistic here. When we get into the later 1930s, especially when we look at Lebensraum, stats come up quite a lot. And an opinion poll that Hitler and the Nazis put out following the invasion of the Rhineland, you know, asking the people of Germany, you know, do you think Hitler's doing the right things? Is he doing okay? 99% of them voted to say, yeah, he's doing a great job. Now, part of me will say that that is accurate. to an extent, and that a lot of the German population would have been very pleased with Hitler doing as he intended, which was abolishing the Treaty of Versailles. However, knowing what I know and what some of you might know about German domestic policy, by 1936, Hitler has very much established himself as a dictator, and the threat of concentration camps, the Gestapo, and everything like that is very much a part of everyday life in Nazi Germany at this stage. So of course 99% of the population are going to say that Hitler's doing an amazing job. That 1% who said, nope, don't think he's doing such a great job, have probably found themselves in concentration camps and being labelled as those who oppose the Nazi regime. Many believed that Hitler's invasion of the Rhineland was a test to see how far he could push things with the treaty. Again, it goes back to what I was just saying before, that analogy of how far can I push this new teacher that I've got in front of me until they completely break. Okay, exactly the same. He's looking to see, well, how are France and Britain going to react to this, especially whilst they're distracted elsewhere. What I love about the Rhineland invasion as well is that it seems like a real coup d'etat from the time. It seems like a real big win, and trust me, like I said, the propaganda that Nazis put out about the militarization of the Rhineland totally demonstrates this was a huge deal. But behind the scenes, this is again something that we get to learn about in hindsight in the future. A lot of Hitler's officials at the top were saying to him, this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea. If this goes wrong and France are there to meet us, we're going to lose. Okay, yes, you've reintroduced conscription, but we are still rebuilding our army. If we go in there and face opposition, we are not coming out of that very well at all. If the League decide to go even further and punish us economically with economic sanctions potentially, again, remember, we know that they're not in the League at this time, but nonetheless, if there is some kind of economic embargo on Germany at this time, that's going to have an effect as well. But Hitler said, no, we're going to push on. And what he does is he tells his soldiers that if you get into the Rhineland and France are there, ready to gun you down, then you turn around and come back. I love that fact. Totally swept under the rug during the 1930s, but as history has gone on and more evidence has come to light, we learn that it was a total gamble. It was a total bluff. It goes back to the idea of that goose step cartoon we've got down there with those streets being empty. Had France been waiting for them, that Rhineland would not have been remilitarized at all. But at the same time, had that happened, knowing that Britain, in terms of popular opinion, was on side with what Hitler was doing, Germany would have come out as the victim. So this was a total win-win situation for Hitler and the Nazis. Remilitarize the Rhineland without any opposition, boom, win. Go into the Rhineland and France are there, then you still win, and France come out looking like the bad people. Because everybody else thinks, well, Britain especially, who are France's closest ally at this time, they think that the remilitarization of the Rhineland is perfectly acceptable. So it's a win-win for Hitler. One last thing I'll mention before we move on to our final part looking at rearmament is the fact that it is following on from the invasion of the Rhineland that we see the end of the Abyssinian crisis in 1936, and that is when Hitler and Mussolini become allies. The Rome-Berlin axis, the Pact of Steel. More on that for what we're going to be having a look at in the latter part of the 1930s. So here we're going to be kind of bringing things together, looking at late 1936 up into 1939 and the outbreak of the Second World War. And a big part from that, as you can see from that double arrow at the top there, is events that happen in Spain. So we're going to be taking a look here at the Spanish Civil War and the peak of Germany's rearmament program. The Spanish Civil War, first of all, breaks out in 1936, and as the name suggests, it is indeed, oh sorry, just wrap my pen around the right way, there we go, it is indeed a civil war, meaning that it is a war between two sides in Spain itself. And in this instance, it was the communists in Spain versus the fascists in Spain. And to be very basic in terms of political spectrum, fascists and Nazis are incredibly similar to each other. They would be placed pretty much in the same place on a political spectrum. So the Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1936. General Franco, who is the leader of the Spanish fascists, was allied with Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. Those of you who've studied the League of Nations as well will know a lot about Mussolini, and if you do want to know more, feel free to check out some of my videos on the League of Nations on this channel here. As I've just mentioned, 1936 is also the same year that Mussolini and Hitler begin their alliance, that Rome-Berlin axis, the Pact of Steel. So Hitler is also brought into the Spanish Civil War. So Mussolini goes in first. Mussolini says, "Hey Franco, I've got this new guy who's my ally now as well. I think he'd be great to join us. Why don't we invite him in? Okay, why don't we invite him into the group chat, if you will? Okay, so let's get him on in there." And Hitler is very keen to join in. Remember, one of Hitler's main aims in foreign policy is to defeat communism, so this is a great opportunity to do that. But also, he is able to use the Spanish Civil War as his dress rehearsal. I often use that phrase. I've got a big background in performance and drama and things like that, so I love the idea of a dress rehearsal for a larger war. Now, notice I've not specifically said here a dress rehearsal for World War II, because I personally even still stand by this idea that even in the mid-1930s, this idea of a huge world war isn't necessarily on Hitler's mind. But I know by 1936 that he is definitely more in favour now of a war with France specifically. So he uses the Spanish Civil War as a dress rehearsal for a larger war, and he uses it to try out his new larger army, which is still growing at this time, the new weaponry, the tanks, the armoured vehicles, the airplanes that he's been working on, and also to try out battle tactics as well. The most famous one that he will go on to use straight away in World War II with the invasion of Poland in September 1939 is the tactic of blitzkrieg, lightning war. Blitz means lightning, krieg means war. So this tactic of blitzkrieg, it's a real shock and awe tactic. You basically go into a location, a town, if you will, and flatten the entire place. You throw everything you've got at it. Aerial bombardment, ground forces as well, everything. And it's exactly like I said, what the Nazis do when they invade Poland in 1939 in September. They use this tactic, but they use it because they've tried it out in the Spanish Civil War. One of the really famous locations where they do this is a place called Guernica. And the reason I mention this place is because Pablo Picasso does a painting all about the Nazis' attack on Guernica, where they completely flatten the place. Check it out on Google if you will. It's a real example of the style of art, obviously, that Pablo Picasso does, but also really represents the horrors of what the Nazis do with that blitzkrieg tactic at Guernica. So the Spanish Civil War, like I said, is his opportunity to try things out. Then in 1938, thanks to reintroducing conscription and all of the other things that he's been developing through the 1930s, by 1938, Germany's army has grown from that 100,000 set out in the Treaty of Versailles to 800,000. Their airplanes have gone from 0 to 2,000, and their submarines, their U-boats, have gone from 0 to 47. So we have got a huge, rapid level of rearmament here in the space of 5 years. This is going to be really, really important. This year 1938 is going to be so important. And the idea of how strong Hitler's army is at this stage is going to be so important when we look at him conquering Lebensraum and taking over territory from 1938 onwards. So that brings together essentially everything that we've been having a look at in terms of rearmament leading up to the Second World War itself. Like I said, a lot of the major things that take place to do with rearmament are earlier on in this timeline. We haven't got as many in the later 1930s because this is when, following on from that strong army he has got from 1938 onwards, where we see this idea of conquering Lebensraum become a much bigger focus of Hitler's foreign policy. Before I leave you completely, I just wanted us to have a think about Taylor's interpretation, where he said that Hitler was a gambler more than a planner. Now, do you think from what we've looked at in this video here, Taylor's interpretation fits with what we've learnt about rearmament? I'll give you a second or two to have a think about it yourself and as to why. So Hitler was a gambler more than a planner, simply took the next logical step to see what he could get away with. He was bold and kept his nerve, as other countries gave in to him and allowed him to get away with each gamble, so he became bolder and risked more. Personally, I think rearmament absolutely fits in with Taylor's interpretation. A gambler more than a planner. Every time he noticed he was able to get away with something, especially when Britain didn't oppose him, he pushed for something a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger until we get to the point where we're at 1938. I think personally, knowing what I know about his conquering of Lebensraum, which is what we're going to move on to look at in our next video, I think it's actually quite possible that from 1938 onwards, Hitler becomes more in a position where he is planning what he is doing rather than necessarily taking risks, because he's got that strong army to back him. So does rearmament fit in with Taylor's interpretation? Absolutely, especially when looking at the events of the earlier 1930s. Thank you so much for listening to this video all on rearmament as a cause of the Second World War. I hope you found it useful. I know it was a long one, but we got through lots and lots of detail in there. Don't forget to like the video if you did find it useful, and you can subscribe to the channel as well to make sure you get updates of when new videos are posted. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me there at One History Help. I am more active on Instagram than I am on Twitter, I must say. And you can also find me on Facebook as well if you search for One History Help. Thank you so much for your time, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.